Good afternoon, good morning, whatever time you're watching this. Morning for us.
Yes.
Excited about this week's Led by the Word. Me and Jessie were just talking a moment ago. The book of Esther literally is just complete. Mm-hmm. Tell them what you said.
I think we touched on it last week, but Esther, I believe, could be mistaken, is the only book in the Bible that follows like the story format, where you have the beginning, middle, kind of like the conflict or climax, and then the resolution, like story format.
My thought was, when you come to the end, chapter 10, I think, is like 3 or 4 verses.
Very small.
Is a little bitty baby chapter. The only thing the whole book is missing is, and they lived happily ever after. The story, we call it Esther. There's got to be Esther hyphen Mordecai.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
I feel like Mordecai is, he's a chunk of this story.
He is. And, in the latter chapters we're going to touch on, he's wearing apparel of victory, where he started out with like sackcloth and, all this because of the decree against the Jews. And you see that complete turnaround. It's beautiful. It's so encouraging. It's got me all riled up.
So we're opening up today. Last week we ended on chapter 4. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes.
This week we're doing 5 through 10. And 10, as I said, that's just a couple sentences there. Not a whole lot to touch on. The premise of the story is despair right now. Mm-hmm. The premise of the story is a villain which appears to have way, way more power than the Jewish people and Esther and Mordecai. Haman's here, he's mad, he's angry, and Jessie was talking about, she was so excited last night, and I was excited. We stayed up, and you're going to hear the evilness of Haman. You're going to hear the man's consumed with evil and anger and jealousy and just strife in his life.
He's super arrogant. That's something I was really honing in on last night. Like, wow.
But I'm going to go ahead and just give you a real quick touch at the end. He loses. And I think sometimes we get in our situation and we look at this one thing, and it's like blinders. It's like when they're training a horse and we're just looking at this one thing and said, how could this work? How could this come to fruit? How could there be any victory in any of this? Mm-hmm. And you can look at this story and see a place with no way out, a place with no escape, a place with no chance, and then still there can be breakthrough for you.
And more than just, okay, I made it through. They had victory. There's one scripture I do want to read. It's a little later on in this, where they basically had rule over those that sought to destroy them. And I was like, ooh, chills. Like, I love that.
There's a couple things I want to touch on in chapter 10. Honestly, there's a couple things in 8, a little bit in... the whole thing's powerful. Go ahead.
It's really good.
Take us through here. We're going to be opening up in chapter 5. Also, today is the 29th, so by the time you see this is edited and published. The announcement will be made. Greater Love TV is in Knoxville, Tennessee.
It's huge.
So thankful for this. 1.1 million, actually it's 1,107,386 people that are TV households with access to Greater Love TV. Had no clue that Knoxville in that area was that large.
It's dense.
We're calling it Knoxville. The antenna is just right outside of the main city, but it's a really tall antenna. It reaches Athens, and it reaches in between Sevierville and Pigeon Forge is the ending of it. So it's an enormous footprint in East Tennessee. I'm just thrilled.
It's huge.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we left off last week, basically, where Esther and Mordecai are discussing this horrible situation where Haman has basically tricked the king into writing this decree to come against them. So they call for a fast, and I love this, right? In chapter 4, basically, she says, if I perish, I perish. Like, it's got to be done. The work has to be done. And I'm going to read verse 1 of chapter 5. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. So Esther put herself in a position to be seen and heard by the king. So many times we have a call, or we've been charged to do a work, right, by God. We are kind of excited, right? But like we think, oh, this should fall in place because it's the will of God. It should be smooth. It should be seamless. This is something Mike and I were discussing, where it can be easy to be discouraged because it's not smooth, it's not seamless. And wait a minute, whoa, the enemy actually doesn't like this. He doesn't like us, and we're facing some pushback, some opposition. We think maybe it should come easy. I know I've been guilty of that in my life. Like, why is this not, flowing? And you can kind of see that in every facet of ministry. Micah, obviously this podcast is geared towards young adults, young people, but Micah and I also do our youth group, our Game Changers, that meets every Thursday. And he teaches Sunday school class, I believe it's 13 to 18.
13 to 18.
And I previously, before I went and had our kids, was teaching a very young class. And so within those different levels of ministry, there can be different challenges and things don't run smooth. If you've ever done children's ministry, you know what I am saying. There can be hiccups, there can be things that are hard. But right now my main ministry and my most important ministry will always be family. And there are days where I'm being tested greatly by our beautiful, wonderful, perfect children that are gifts from God. And I told Mike, I was like, why is this, I'm called to this, why is this so challenging? Like, why is the work starting to feel workish? Like, why is it not all fun and games and just, like super easy? And a lot of times, like, our spirit loves the calling, but then when it comes to do the physical part, we're like, what? What are we doing? Esther had this charge laid upon her, and she's like, okay, I got my clothes on, I'm putting it in the right place, like I'm going to be seen by this man. And this was a huge deal because the situation was, if he saw her and was like, what is she doing here? I didn't invite her. He could basically instantly command her to be killed on the spot. That's what she meant by, if I perish, I perish.
And if you pause and look at this, look at the king's track record.
Oh, yeah.
So it's more than just the king has power. A lot of powerful people have the ability to do bad things. He has a track record of doing some intense things.
And not being super nice to his wife, yeah?
Yeah, so Esther's got a lot in front of her, looking at this like, ooh, Mordecai, I don't know. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff that could put doubt in her. There's a lot of stuff that could put discouragement. I was reading this and I try to think, what are they thinking? And if you put yourself in Esther's shoes, she's got the pressure of her life and her kingdom on her. That's a lot.
It is. I mean, her whole people are relying on her.
I think we take for granted too much the calling on each of us as individuals. We're going into this, this is about me. Goodness, look at what I'm facing. Look what I'm going through. You better believe there is outreach in your life. Mm-hmm. And this ain't just about you.
That's right.
This isn't even close to being just about you.
Yeah, I was going to say, probably on the contrary.
I think something that's amazing to think, is sad to think. The enemy sees more potential in your outreach sometimes than we do ourselves. Oh. The enemy looks and says, ooh, that's a dangerous, dangerous person to my purpose and my kingdom. And then we're here, we're facing the attack, we're facing the spiritual opposition, we're facing the rulers of wickedness in high places, and then we're like, oh man, this is tough for me. This is tough for everything around you.
Right. But I mean, she did it. We had to be like Esther. We have to put on our royal apparel, in the spiritual. We have to be armed up with the armor of God. We have to be in the situation that He has called us, and we have to show up. I mean, you can't do children's ministry if you're not physically there. It's kind of challenging. So you have to be in the right for every situation, both prayed up and showing up physically like Esther. And I love that she did that. Yes, I love that. Willing and working. So the king, of course, is like, hey, girl, like, what do you want? Like, you can have half the kingdom, babe. What's going on? She's like, honestly, I just would really like to throw a banquet for you and Haman. Which is huge that she said that because if you remember, Haman is the bad guy in this situation. Like, there's no gray area. He's the baddie. And so they invite him, and the king's like, oh, wow, what a great wife. I made the best choice. This is wonderful. Let's do it. I'm listening to your petition. Let's have this banquet. So they're at the banquet, and he's like, what can I really do for you? And she's like, honestly, I just super want to bless you. Like, let's do this again tomorrow. It's going to be even better. And he's like, okay, yeah. So Haman's like basically skipping home. He's like, oh yeah, I'm on top of the world. I got invited by name. Esther wanted me and the king. And and then he sees Mordecai, and everything just crumbles in his spirit because Mordecai won't bow to him. And he's like, instantly, he's like, oh, that guy, I can't stand that guy. So near the end of chapter 5, he gets together his friends, basically his servants, his wife, and he talks about how great Haman is. Haman is like second to the king. Haman has all these riches. Haman has all these sons. Haman is great. Have you heard about Haman? He's just great. And then he's like, also, Esther, the queen, heard of her. She had a banquet for the king and didn't ask any other man there but me by name. I'm special. but it compares to nothing because I hate this guy Mordecai. He won't bow down to me. I'm ready to, like, what do I do about this? So they suggest, hey, I have an idea. Let's build gallows and hang him. And Mordecai's like, Haman's like, genius. Let's do this. Like, let's do it. And it's so ironic because foreshadowing, that's going to be his undoing completely.
Now, keep in mind, these names, I want you to follow them through. You got Haman is angry because of Mordecai.
Yes.
And something I caught, and I may be misreading this, but I want you to check on me with this. At the end of 5, Haman's running home skipping in arrogance and chaos, sees Mordecai, gets furious. It's like anger, depression, everything consumes him, jealousy and rage. So he goes, he can't sleep. He gathers his people, gathers his wife, and goes to his house. You switch over to chapter 6. And I love the song, Even When I Don't See It, You're Working.
Yes.
If you're Esther and you're Mordecai, it's like, whoa, this is tough. And you're looking at stuff that you're not seeing. In the private room of the king, listen to this, chapter 6, verse 1. And on that night could not the king sleep. Haman can't sleep because he's angry at Mordecai. The king can't sleep. So you know what the king does when he can't sleep? He says, I want the most boring thing possible. Go grab the person and read the books of remembrance.
Right.
Just read the book. I'm going to go to sleep. This will be exhausting. So they read the book, and they come to a story, and he says, now hang on. Read that story. The story is there's a man at the gate that hears 2 guardsmen discussing killing the king. And he said, oh, wow. So he snitched them out, and they caught the 2 bad guys. So the king says, what did we do for that guy? That stranger, that man named Mordecai. The same night that Haman's over here trashing Mordecai, you can't tell me God didn't steal this man's sleep.
Oh, sure.
You can't tell me. You can't. God's moving so hard in your background. You may be sitting at your couch. You may be kneeling saying, why, God, why ain't you doing nothing? And God's literally in royalty rooms, still in sleep, lining things up, having the right page. This book couldn't have been a page. I think what do you think?
Oh, no.
I think it was a big book.
Yeah.
And they happened to read the right page at the right moment at the right time. So here's what the king says. The king says, what did we do for this man? And they're like, we didn't do nothing for him. So tell them what the king does. I love this, the irony in this and the arrogance in this.
So he asked, right? And basically, he's like, we got to get to the bottom of this. And I love this. In verse 4, he said, who is in the court? Now Haman had come outward of the court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. So here's the situation. King is like, let's ask who's in the court and get to the bottom of what can we do for Mordecai. Really want to bless this guy. Haman's coming into the court and is like, I'm going to speak to the king about killing Mordecai, right? So they say, hey, Haman's in the court. He's like, okay, bring him in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him in verse 6, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? We're talking about Mordecai, right?
Talking about Mordecai, not Haman.
We want to bless Mordecai. Now Haman thought in his heart, well, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? So he's like, wow, the king wants to bless Haman because Haman's such a good guy. Wow, I'm humble. So he says in verse 7, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought out which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rides upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. So basically, they want all this to happen and like have a parade in the street. Haman's like, I deserve this. I'm great. This is wonderful. So the king turns around in verse 10 and says, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all thou hast spoken. Like, what a gut punch. You know, he came into the king to be like, let's kill Mordecai. And the king's like, you know what? I do all this great stuff for Mordecai. Like,
I see this in my life too, where I don't place enough trust in God.
Right.
You know, where I'm like, is it going to work out? Is it going to pan out? A gentleman called me the other day and said, I'm beginning to realize there's a huge difference between faith and trust. Esther knows, without a doubt, there is unpotential power in the word of the king.
Right.
But does she have the trust in the king? So sometimes we need to just back up and say, we got the faith. We've been given the faith by God. Every man is given a measure of faith that we need. There ain't nothing we could ever face where we don't have enough faith. Do we have enough trust? And you see this playing out, and how it's just working over and over in the background. Esther's not in this room, and God's working. You're not in all of the situation, and God's working.
And what's crazy is as this is happening, like they take him through the little parade, he's riding on the horse and all this, the decree hasn't been reversed.
No.
We're still Jews, public number, enemy one, whatever. And in the midst of this, Mordecai is getting blessed. And I think that's huge. You know, sometimes we're like, oh, this is just gloom, doom, and despair. You can walk in blessings even in your darkest days. And that's hard to say, and it's hard to walk out. But it is possible. We see it here in the scriptures.
So we step into chapter 7.
Yes.
Chapter 7 is where this whole thing goes sideways, if I could say that.
Yeah.
Goes great for the Jewish people and Esther and Mordecai. Goes sideways for Haman. So he's built this 49 cubit, 50 cubit, whatever it was, gallows in his household area. And he's like, I'm going to hang them. I'm going to destroy them. This is going to be their demise. So they're at the final banquet, and it's called the Banquet of Wine. And if you remember chapter 1, the king doesn't hold his wine well. The king he struggles with this.
Yes.
So they're in this room. Esther's throwing this thing, and you got King Esther Haman. Mm-hmm. Tell us what happens here in the dynamic.
So the king asks again, because he wants to bless this girl, right?
In front of Haman.
She's done so well to him. And he's like, honey, what can I do for you? So she comes completely clean to him and is like, listen, you know, someone is coming against us. I'm petitioning for my people. Like, you know, people want to come against us. And so the king's like, who wants to come against you? Who wants to kill you? In verse 4, he says, who is he and where is he that does presume in his heart to do so? Like, who does this guy think he is? Show me. Name him. I'm going to go get him. Verse 6, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. Like Micah said, there are 3 people at least in this room. And she's like, that guy right there.
And listen what happens. In that moment, the king is vexed. He doesn't do nothing.
Instantly, he's so angry, he leaves the room.
He leaves. He runs out to probably some pretty place, some thanking place, some spot, and he's just got to go. The 2 people left in the room are Esther and Haman. You know what Esther does? Haman runs up to her and, Esther, please, I beg of you, Esther, I beg of you. Esther doesn't reply. Esther goes to bed. Esther says, now here's where we need more trust. She says, I've praised my God, I've worshiped my God, I've told him. Now I'm going to go rest.
I mean, her job's done, really.
She said, I'm going to rest. He goes to bed, and you know what Haman does? Follows her into her rest. Still pleading, still begging, still saying, please, Esther, for my life. Esther, look, the king's mad at me. I wanted to kill you. I wanted to kill Mordecai. I don't want to die. Please, Esther. At that very moment when he's crying and he's begging, the king says, okay, I've cooled off, and opens the door. And you know what the king sees? Haman over Esther resting in a bed. So the king says, you were going to kill him. Now you try to take my wife in my house?
Yep.
God worked this thing all the way through.
Right.
And Haman didn't even have those intentions in that moment.
No, he didn't even know Esther was a Jew. He concealed her identity.
He didn't even know his intention for her in the bedroom was not that. It was pleading and begging for his life. He should have never went in there, but he followed her in crying, begging, please, please, please.
Yeah.
And you know, have you met arrogant people in your life? When it turns on them, they get emotional quick.
Oh, yes.
And he's just begging, please, please. Follows her in. All I see in the book of Esther, how much does God move in situations? Not on a big scale like he's going to move that one time. God's moving. I think it's James chapter 10 verse 50 or James chapter 50 verse 10. He can take what the enemy means for evil and he can turn those things for my good. Those gallows that Haman built, it says the king steps in, so the maidens grab him and cover his head.
Yep.
Haman can't see, Haman can't hear, Haman's blind. And the king says, put him on the gallows.
That he had built.
That he had built for Mordecai, that he had built for Esther, and that he had built for all the Jews. Because the issue, he didn't know he built for Esther, but for Esther, because she was a Jew. And for all the Jews is now going to be the essence of his demise. And you better believe and trust in God that what the enemy is trying to do to destroy you. You know, we get these attacks in our health, and we're like, oh goodness, the enemy is going to literally kill me in this health attack. You watch that turn around into a healing, and the thing that the enemy used to destroy you, God is going to use as a testimony to go and reach out. And it's going to be a gallows to destroy lack of faith in God, lack of trust in God. You see where someone you're praying for is bound by sin, and you're like, Lord, I just don't understand. I don't understand. And then when they're delivered, that thing that tried to destroy them is a testimony. And it becomes a 49 cubic platform of destruction for the enemy.
That's right.
You end here at 7, and then the story gets more.
Yes. So she kind of comes before and is like, please, can you, these letters that have been written, is there any way to, the words are reverse the letters. And the king's like, done. Here's my ring. Like, let's do this.
Oh, the ring. When they hang Mordecai, when they hang Haman, the king goes and says, get my ring from him. And he says, that ring was my power, that ring was my sign. If you look at a ring today, Jessie, she's got her wedding ring on, I'm wearing a silicone ring. There's beauty in it, there's a rock in it, but there's no power in that. A king's ring has a specific shape, a specific cut, so when they do a decree, when they do a letter, he can take the ring and he can seal it. So when he takes that ring off Haman and he gives it to Esther and Mordecai, all the king's power was presented. And you can see a representation of God saving us. And then you see representation, God says, I'm no longer satisfied saving you. I want you to have my power of the Holy Ghost.
Yes.
And I think this is what I believe. I think a lot of us are wearing the ring, wearing the Holy Ghost, but we're not doing enough decrees.
Oh.
And this is my conviction in this. It's like, Lord, I have power in my prayer life. Zach, we got power when we bow our heads and close our eyes and seek out to our God. And we don't just have to say, God, will you help me in this? I can go to the gates of hell. And I can say in my decree, in the name of Jesus, I have it right here. And you can see the power of God bestowed upon us. And you see how God not only bestowed the power on Esther, he took the power away from the enemy.
That's right. Yeah, stripped him of everything.
Honestly, you could end at chapter 7 and be like, this was a good story. But it gets better. It literally gets better.
So when they reverse the letters, the king even kind of clarifies that no one's going to undo these. Ain't no one have the power to undo these letters. What I've said, what we've decreed, what we've rewritten, we reverse those letters, it is done. It cannot be touched. So we see in the land the Jews become exalted, and a lot of people lived in the fear of them because they were so mighty. Mordecai just waxes greater and greater in wealth and strength and in might. And I love, this is the verse that I really love. Verse 9. So they're doing this decree. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. So we don't wrestle against flesh and blood these days. This is the New Testament covenant. But your adversary, the devil, seeks to rule over you. If he can't get you out of God's house, obviously he can't get you out of God's hand. You're saved. He will try to oppress you day in and day out. He will try to stop your calling. He will try to have rule over you. He'll try to make you so filled with shame and guilt that you are paralyzed. You can't do anything for God, anything in the kingdom. But I love this. They had rule over them that hated them. This goes right with what you were saying with the authority and the power in the ring. You can have the authority and the power when the relationship with Christ over those things. Like fear, you don't have rule over me. Doubt, you don't have rule over me. Shame and guilt, be gone. You do not have rule over me. You see that? It's so beautiful. And when I read that this morning as a refresher, I was like, oh, this is empowering.
I think of how we talked about willing and working.
Yes.
But you see Mordecai. Mordecai gets saved. Mordecai could have been selfish. Mordecai could have been overconsumed with anxiety. Mordecai could have been lazy. Mordecai goes through this, and you know what he does once he has this ability? He says, okay, I need horses, I need riders. We're going from India to Ethiopia, and we're instilling this decree. When God does something for you, it ain't just for you.
That's right.
When God does a breakthrough for you, and we get selfish, and we're like, oh man, I've been having nightmares forever. I can sleep now. Mm-hmm. And we don't go tell somebody else with nightmares a testimony.
Right.
We, instead of going from India to Ethiopia, we just go to bed.
Oh.
And we got to understand, Mordecai saw the issue at hand. He saw what was at stake, and he fought for the people.
He did. I mean, his heart was always for the people. When he was pleading before Esther, he's like, the people's lives are at stake. Like, this is huge.
It was never about a bigger castle.
No.
It was never about more chariots. It was about life and death.
Absolutely.
And you see that not just at the beginning of a story. Once life is saved, you see it at the end.
Absolutely. And the people, I love how they don't just survive. They're thriving by the end of Esther. They they have their feasts. They celebrate Purim. It's this whole thing. I love it. One of the end verses of the book, it says, "For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed." Like Micah said, it was always about the people. It wasn't just about Mordecai. Mordecai used his new power, his new influence, his new might, always for the people, on behalf of the people. We see that reflected. We talk about godly leaders. We talk about Moses, interceding for the people. And we see that here, too, where Mordecai is like, it's always been about this. It's reiterating what you're saying.
And when God's will is intact, everyone's blessed. I don't think Mordecai and the Jewish people were blessed, but the rest of the kingdom weren't.
Sure.
And I know this because in chapter 10, verse 2, the king says, "In all the acts and the power of his might, the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai." King was selfish. He's not going to be bragging up Mordecai if he didn't come out good in some way or another.
Oh, right.
And I want to tell you, there's going to be people in your life blessed because you're in their life.
Oh, yeah.
And we see that here. So I want to encourage you. Understand, you're not wrestling flesh and blood, and you're not wrestling just a battle that's only you. We see so many people facing battles, and they inward it, and it becomes awful. It faces in drunkenness, it faces in isolation, suicide. But you're facing a battle that is greater than that. And you got to understand what's at stake, and that be one of the driving forces. If I perish, I perish. But I'm going to fight for these people.
Yeah.
That was a long podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in with us. Really, really enjoyed studying this one out with you, Jessica. And I say studying this out. We study separate, but we come here and we gather to teach it. Enjoyed the book of Esther. Nehemiah is next, correct?
I think we just finished Nehemiah. I think we're going into
Job. Oh, no. Job is not one of my favorite books. Esther is one of my favorites. But Job, we did a 3-week study in Sunday school on Job, and there are so much to glean from it. Like, it's a powerful book. Honestly, last night we were ministering unto a young man, and we were quoting many verses from the book of Job. I'm telling you, tune in with us. It's going to be an exciting time going forward. Thank you so much. God bless you.
God bless you.